spent a good portion of time learning about different types of adaptations from different modalities and how they can be specific depending on the exact modality that we are using for training. We actually, last test we talked about specificity. That was one of the essay questions. For the most part, we did really, really well with that question. But let's look at that just a little bit further. What is specificity when we apply it to training? We can talk about specific angles. We can talk about velocity and energy systems. But I know some of you, we have a couple basketball players, baseball player, swimmer, football player in this class. What is training that's specific for those sports? Right now, this is the majority of this class is based off of resistance training. So how is resistance training going to be specific for those sports? When we're talking specificity, and we learned about that, the SAID principle, we are going to, it's the specific adaptations to impose demands. We adapt exactly to what is imposed upon us. If we only train 2 or 3 degrees of motion, that's where we're going to get stronger. If we only train at high velocities, then our slow velocity strength isn't going to increase as much. So that's basically the SAID principle, but how does that apply when we are looking at training an athlete? A lot of coaches want sport-specific training, but when we look at it from a big picture, what exactly is sport-specific training? Best thing I can look at, give an example, is there such thing as a track squat, a football squat, or a basketball squat? No. A squat is a squat. Now, there may be limitations based off body types, but what is occurring during a squat is going to be the same regardless of if you're an athlete, non-athlete, football player, track athlete, 90-year-old individual. And the reason I'm using the squat, it's probably one of the more researched exercises. If your squat goes up, there's a good chance your vertical is going to go up. That's great for basketball. If your squat goes up, your 40-yard sprint is going to go down. That's great if you're running track. That's great if you're a football player. So there's a lot of research showing the benefits of increasing 1 repetition squat. Now, that kind of goes to an extent slightly against that SAID principle, because if we're training on 1 repetition max, the velocity is going to be slow. But if the intent is to move it as fast as possible, there is belief that intent can override the velocity that we're actually moving at. That's still debatable, but if the intent's there, you're trying to move the weight fast. And plus, when you're maxing out, if you try to move that weight slow, it's not going to move at all. But the squat, as I just said, it improves vertical, it improves starting speed. It's great for overcoming inertia. Now, that's great for athletics. Let's take it a step further. What if you're training a 90-year-old individual? What is one of the most important things to help increase their quality of life? Can they sit up and from a chair? They're eating dinner. Does somebody have to come help them out of the table? I'm sitting down right now. Now I'm standing up. Now look, I'm squatting down to my chair. I'm standing up. That's a pretty functional exercise right there. Squat is probably one of the most functional exercises. So, that doesn't really apply to sports, but it applies to overall well-being for the general population. I'm not saying the squat's the greatest end-all be-all exercise, but you can apply it to a lot of different situations. So, is it a specific exercise? No, it's not. And I think that's one aspect that a lot of people don't understand when they're talking about specificity. A lot of these exercises can be used for a lot of different programs. The rep ranges, the intensity can be similar depending on what your overall goal is as well. So I think in general, we need to get out of the, oh, this is basketball specific, oh, this is baseball specific. And a lot of times when I was working at the college level, recruiting trips, recruits would come talk to me. I'd tell them straight up, my goal is not to make you a better basketball player. I'm not going to be the one to teach you how to shoot. I'm not going to be the one to teach you how to rebound, how to pass, how to run your X's and O's. I'm going to get you jumping higher. I'm going to get you running up and down the court faster. I'm going to get your ability to change direction to improve. That's the exact same thing I told my football players. I'm going to get you faster. I'm going to get you to knock guys off the line of scrimmage. I'm not going to be able to teach you how to read the holes. That's not my job. I'm not going to be able to teach you to read a pulling guard. That's not my job. That's your football coach's job. I am going to make you a better athlete. And I think that is one of the key aspects when we're looking at strength and conditioning as a whole. The goal is to increase overall athleticism. And how are we measuring that? Weight room numbers are great. Like I just mentioned, your squat goes up to an extent, that vertical jump's going to go up, your 40 is going to go down. But those last two things I mentioned, vertical jump, 40, those can be considered key performance indicators. KPIs. That's like the new hot phrase going around, KPIs. They basically indicate how well you're going to perform in your given sport. Now, the 40 is an example for football. Vertical is an example for basketball and football. 60-yard dash is used in baseball, similar to the 40. If you're improving your 40-yard dash, chances are your 60-yard dash is going to improve. So those are things to think about, because either by the end of this week or sometime next week, I will have posted, you all are going to have a class project. I'm going to give you an athlete. It may be a hockey player, maybe a figure skater. We don't know yet. You are going to design a program for them to help them become better at their sport. But like I just said, it's really to help them become a better overall athlete. So, why did I mention KPIs? You're going to have to do a little research. You'll find some articles. You'll cite the articles for me and tell me, for this sport, these are my 4 or 5 KPIs. This is why I think they're key for their sport. Once we know what the KPIs are, then we can start to design a training program around those specific aspects. Now, to get back to the specificity, I'm going to assume a lot of your programs are going to be very, very similar, which is okay, because we're trying to improve overall athleticism. But the specificity part, and like I said, we just made, the goal is to make better athletes. However, there is a specificity aspect to training. Even though I just said it's not a very big one, 80% of my programs are probably similar between track, cross country, volleyball, basketball, wrestling. They're going to be really similar if you looked at it. But one thing to take into consideration, the sport that you're given, what are the biggest injuries? That is where we can start working on specificity. If we're looking at football right now, one could be the ACL, but a bigger one that gets a lot more attention, concussions. What can we do to minimize the risk of concussion? A lot of people are saying neck strength and overall trapezius strength. Research supports that. So part of your program, you're going to have to tell me what the injuries are that your athlete could face, where you got that research from, and what you're going to do to minimize that risk of injury. So, concussions for football. Look at track. Hamstrings are a big one. Baseball. Any overhead motion, baseball, volleyball, tennis, where you're throwing this motion over and over again. We're looking at rotator cuff. We're looking at labral issues. So, 10-15% of your program is going to be specific to that sport. So if I'm doing baseball, I'm doing something that is going to protect my rotator cuff, that's going to protect my shoulder. I'm not going to give you the exact answers right now. That's for you to, if you have questions, you can ask, but rotator cuff type exercises. I said football, let's strengthen the neck in whatever means you think is best suited for your environment. The hamstrings, there are a lot of different options for the hamstrings. Think of leg curl may not be specific, but if we look at the other origin insertion and the functions of the hamstring, remember it also helps extend the hips. So stiff leg deadlifts, even the squat, that's where the hamstring comes into play. So what are we doing to strengthen the weak areas or the areas that are most likely to be injured for our given sport? And when I'm looking at it, I'm looking at a global thing, so that's why I gave those examples of injuries: concussions, hamstring pulls, and rotator cuff issues. Those make the media all the time. But then for me personally, I look at my individual teams. We may not have had any hamstring injuries. I'm not saying that's because of what we did, but knock on wood, we may not have had any hamstring injuries, and we'll probably continue doing what we're doing because of that. But if we're looking at track, what injuries are happening? What is the biggest injury for my given teams? So that's a local thing. So I look globally, what's the big things? What can I do to minimize those injuries? And then I'm looking locally at my specific teams and seeing if what I'm doing could be causing that because we're overtraining, or if it's something I need to implement into the program to minimize that risk. So this is just to get you thinking about developing a program for an athlete that I'm going to give you. Now, exercise selection, we're going to go into that a little bit more as the semester goes on. I mentioned a squat for functionality. Generally speaking, and this is, functional training is a big thing nowadays, but functional training's been around for a long, long time. Like I said, squat's a functional exercise. If we look back at Russian literature, their take on functional exercises were exercises that increased overall athleticism. And 95% of the time, those are your multi-joint exercises that are training the largest muscle mass possible. We're talking squats, we're talking deadlifts, we're talking our Olympic lifts. Those are functional for them. We can throw in the presses to an extent, and they're functional for everyday living as well. Our presses and our back pulling exercises. Structural exercises would also be in, Western hemisphere would be considered more isolation exercises, and those are the exercises where we're probably going to see a lot more hypertrophy, specific hypertrophy. You can get hypertrophy from a squat, don't get me wrong. If you train it right, you can get hypertrophy, but is it coming from the glutes? Is it coming from the hamstrings, the quads? Depends on the individual, depends on how you're squatting. When we're talking structural exercises in Russian literature, or isolation exercises, these are your bicep curls. These are your leg curls, leg extensions. They are targeting one muscle, and they're probably better suited for hypertrophy. And they're also suited to help lagging muscles. So if we're squatting, depending on your weakness in the squat, maybe you're not squatting as much because you have weak quads. We can isolate that muscle, and the isolation muscles, number one, they're going to help with hypertrophy, but they're also going to help increase your overall functional exercises as well. Just something to consider. If you have any questions, reach out through email, and I'm working on posting the class project and chapter 4 PowerPoint for you.